Since becoming a parent, I think the biggest thing that impacted me was realizing that I'm a role model for my kids. Everything that I do as a dad, my kids, they absorb, they start to emulate it. And that's the thing that many of us may not appreciate, not just the impact we have on our kids, but actually the impact our own parents had on us. That means a lot of the wonderful habits and a lot of the wonderful things that our moms and dads did, well, that oftentimes gets reflected in us. But some of the areas where our parents may have fallen short, well, that might be impacted in our behavior too. And this is a topic that is called generational cycles. Now, in order to explore this topic of generational cycles and figure out how do we break some of these generational cycles, we're joined today by Dr. Susie Ismail. Now, if you are someone who has, for example, attended the ISNA or ICNA conventions, you'll know that, mashallah, Dr. Susie is a household name in our American Muslim community. She is the founder and director of Cornerstone. It's a nonprofit, faith-based communication intervention organization. They have locations all around the world, and they help families in various areas. Dr. Susie has published many books, including The Modern Muslim Marriage and 9 to 5 and When Muslim Marriage Fails and several other topics. She's a visiting professor at Rutgers University and DeVry University. She's presented all across the world, including places like Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Columbia and NYU. And mashallah, we are super excited to welcome her to our conversation today. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Susie.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for that introduction and that welcome.
The pleasure is all mine, and we're appreciative of your time today. So diving right in, gosh, this sounds like such a kind of like a loaded term, but what are generational cycles?
I think it's a great topic that we're exploring today because for all of us who are parents, we've probably had that moment of realization where we're talking to our children and suddenly we're like, oh my goodness, I sound just like my mom, or wow, that sounds like something my dad would have said to me. And it's interesting because I feel like growing up, so many times we think to ourselves, like, I will never do what my parents did, or, I'm never going to treat my kids the way that my parents did. So when we look at generational cycles, a lot of times it is that repetitive behavior, whether positive or negative. Sometimes when we think of generational cycles, our mind immediately goes to the negative, but positive or negative, and how we respond to our own children, that process of tarbiyah and how we raise our children, it can be cyclical, where we can repeat negative elements that we may have experienced in our childhood, even though with every fiber of our being, we may have rejected them as children and thought that we'd never repeat them. It may, come to the surface again if we haven't healed, if we haven't addressed them, or we may repeat positive elements. There may be things that really worked in our own parents', journey of tarbiyah that we repeat as well.
I really appreciate that. On a personal level, my dad, when he was very young, 13 years old, his father passed away. And so as a kid, I remember my dad would always tell me, he'd say, Amin, I never really had a dad, so I don't really know how to do this. I don't know how I'm supposed to behave in this situation. And, I would say, well, then, Dad, why don't you read a book on it? Come on, get smart on it then, But I share that to say, certainly, how we learn to parent, the most basic role model and tool that we have to learn is by emulating our own parents. So I wonder, Susie, is there a way that we can kind of show ourselves a mirror or become cognizant of maybe some of the habits we've taken from our parents?
Yeah. So I think you bring up two really good points in the example. First, the fact that, your father, when he thought of his own father passing, Allah yarhamu, it was hard for him to imagine, well, what does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be a father? And so maybe he felt like he was kind of paving the path without having experience there. And on the one hand, that can be actually a really positive way of moving forward because you are kind of starting fresh. You're treating your children as independent personalities without trying to superimpose like your upbringing on them. And so that can be really positive. But, on the other hand, it can also be very daunting and it can feel like you don't have that sense of guidance. So when you talk about like breaking the generational cycle, again, there's positive and there's negative, right? Some things we actually want to enhance and not necessarily break, and some things we do want to step away from. I think one of the really important narrations from our Islamic history comes from Ali radiallahu anhu, who had said, "Do not raise your children as you were raised, for every generation has different problems and different challenges than the challenges and problems that you face." So I think step one is definitely being able to recognize that your children are growing up and living in a time that is different from the time that you grew up and lived in. They're going to have different challenges, different ways of approaching the world, and being able to respect that and recognize that. And number two, seeking healing, that if there was traumatic experiences, for example, if you grew up in a household where there was a lot of criticism, if you grew up in a household where domestic violence was the norm, if you grew up in a household where there was psychological abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, learning how to heal from that and to recognize that what you experienced does not define you, that can help in making sure you don't replicate those patterns in your own family building.
I want to ask a question, right? So say, for example, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, okay, well, I know that my childhood wasn't perfect. And I might even say, but whose childhood was perfect? But regardless, I know that my childhood wasn't perfect. Say, for example, I know that when I grew up, there was a lot of maybe negativity, okay? Or, one of the big things that like has been a big change, I think, in our community is actually the use of physical discipline, right? So I know, in the past, there've been, the idea of throwing a sandal, okay, or something like that. We joke around about it. But of course, today, I think, things have changed and people have kind of are no longer using that form of discipline. Alhamdulillah. Say I'm aware of this. And I say, okay, well, I'm aware of it. Do I really need to like heal? Like, is it really important that I actually like take time to like heal as a person? Does that really matter?
So, in all of our intervention programs, we always say that the first step towards, improving oneself to becoming the best version of yourself, whatever that may look like, is awareness. So first and foremost, it's being aware of your history, being aware of what you experienced. So if you are aware that growing up, yes, your parents would sometimes use physical forms of discipline. We're not talking about abuse, but we're talking about, the whole concept of spare the rod, spoil the child, and you grew up with that. If you are able to recognize and identify that, yes, this was a part of my history, this was a part of how I grew up, but again, the challenges of that time are different than the challenges of this time. The society of that time is different than the society of this time. The cultural implications of that time may have been different than this time. That awareness can lead you to a better understanding of your own behaviors and your own responses to your children. So I would say in cases of abuse, in cases of traumatizing incidences, and trauma can occur in different ways for different people. Two people could face the same challenge. One person may have residual trauma from that challenge and the other may not. So, healing from trauma, that is something that I think everyone has to kind of embark on that journey if they have experienced something that left a traumatizing mark on them. But awareness is the first step. Be aware.
So I heard you say, okay, first you have to be aware of it. And then number two is like, look, if it is trauma, like you really do need to heal from it. Now, let's pull this thread a little bit more. Like, what does it look like to heal from trauma? Like, does that mean that I go seek professional help and talk to someone about it? What are the different ways to heal? And I guess, how do I know if I've actually healed from it?
Yeah, yeah. So, there's definitely different avenues of therapeutic interventions. And of course, I'm a bit biased because I'm a huge fan of counseling. I think there's a lot of different forms of
Says the founder of cornerstonecounseling.com. No, I'm kidding. Anyways, please go on.
Yeah, so I think, there's different therapeutic interventions that work for different people. And, a lot of times when we think of counseling, we think of lying down on a couch and, talking about your problems with someone and having someone take notes on it. And, talk therapy is just one form, but there are different therapeutic interventions that work. So when we talk about healing, it's a very personalized journey. For some people, healing may be, unpacking that trauma with a specialist, with, a counselor who can guide them through it. For some people, it may be exploring avenues of EMDRR or exploring avenues of CBT or DBT, like more structured forms of therapy. For some people, it may be seeking the help of a psychiatrist who can take a medical perspective on the mental impact. For others, it may be, looking and seeking spiritual outlets and avenues. I don't think there's a one size fits all when we talk about healing. I think it's about finding the pieces of the puzzle that come together to help you through that trauma. And then the second part of your question, how do you know whether or not you've healed? When you can identify choices that you're making that are no longer rooted in your past experiences, but are instead rooted in being able to evaluate the current situation, then that's usually a good indicator of being on the journey towards healing. I don't ever want to say that anyone is completely healed. I think it's a journey, and we constantly take steps towards reaching a better version of ourselves.
I appreciate that. So, just to internalize what I heard you say, look, when you look at healing, there's not a one size fits all thing. Yes, there is a lot of value in seeking professional help. And when you've actually healed, when, you're in a position where you have to make a decision and you're actually cognizant of, hey, this is what maybe the old me would do because of like my background, but I'm not going to do that this time. Like actually having that self-awareness to kind of go through that process and make that decision. I really appreciate that. Now, I'm curious, Dr. Susie, you're in a very unique role because you've obviously been able to serve many people in our community. What are examples of, common kind of like toxic, like generational behavior that many parents may have acquired from their parents that they may not even be aware of?
Yeah. So great question. We're hearing a lot among maybe, the younger generation. We hear the term psychological abuse quite frequently. And a lot of times when we approach maybe like, the parental generation or the grandparents' generation, the concept of psychological abuse seems so foreign. Like, what the heck is that? What does it mean? Abuse is like smacking someone around. I've never smacked my kid around, but psychological abuse is that feeling that, throughout childhood, maybe it comes in the form of excessive criticism. Maybe it comes in the form of gaslighting. Maybe it comes in the form of, constantly being put down, feelings not validated. We live in a culture and a society today here in the West, whether in the US or in Canada, where you're identifying and seeing a lot more psychological awareness, a lot more awareness of mental health and mental wellness. But for many parents, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, it was, when you look at kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as long as the physiological was being met, as long as the safety and security was being met, for many parents and grandparents, that concept of love, belonging, of self-esteem, of self-actualization, that was just fluff. They were trying to survive. They had immigrated to new countries. They were trying to make ends meet. Now, for the coming generations, those areas, like, those emotional needs are very important. And when they're not met, it can feel very much like psychological abuse. And we tend to see a lot of carryover from that type of psychological abuse, whether it is gaslighting, criticism, issues with attachment. And we see it replicated within the dynamics of the child's family and how they interact with their children and their spouse. But there's more awareness of it. It's not just functioning and this is how it is. And that can cause internal struggles and trauma as well when you feel like something's just not right, but you just don't know how to fix it.
So that's very fascinating. The idea is a lot of these kind of invisible pieces like criticism and not validating and feeling of belonging and things like that It's interesting. I remember I was telling my dad, we had recently done some research with Nora Kids where we try to understand the impact of, this was in 2016. This is when Donald Trump was elected. What impact that had on 5 to 9 year old children. And the result was many of the kids didn't feel like they belonged.
Mhm.
Um, and I remember telling my dad about it. And I use my dad as an example because I love my dad. And also I think it's maybe something that people can relate to. And I said, Dad, we did this big study. We interviewed like 400 kids from 5 cities. And we learned that many kids don't feel like they belong. And my dad's like, Allahu Akbar.
Mhm.
First world problems. Are you kidding me? They don't feel like they belong. Oh no, that's too bad. And of course he was being sarcastic, but I was like, no, Dad, belonging matters. And he's like, okay, son,
Mhm.
sure, if you tell me. But
Mhm.
anyways, I really do appreciate that. And so in the context of generational cycles, it's this idea of if our parents may not have valued these items, perhaps we also may not value these items. Is that how it kind of manifests itself?
So it can actually go both ways. We sometimes see overcompensation arising in parents and how they parent their children. So a parent, for example, who grew up with dismissive parents, or with parents who were absent, or with parents who were overly critical, you may find that parent trying so hard to connect with their children to the point that they actually push the children away because they may have inherently kind of taken on the traits of criticism, but they're trying to couch it in, words of endearment. So, Habibi, Beta, but still giving the criticism, rather than the affirmation, yet thinking that they are giving affirmation. And then we also can see it replicated in the fact that, struggling to understand or conceptualize what the child is going through because the parents, of the parent never conceptualized or understood what they were going through. And a lot of times that idea of like, well, I turned out just fine and my parents never said I love you, or I never got hugged and look at me, I'm thriving. And so sometimes you'll see that also in that generational cycle that we're talking about.
Interesting. And I never thought about this idea of overcompensating, which is really interesting to think about because truly, when we were preparing for this conversation, I was like, I don't know if this idea of overcompensating is very fascinating. This idea of, well, my parents did this, so I'm going to make sure I never do that. And then you kind of like the pendulum completely swings in the opposite direction.
Mhm.
Interesting. So, we've been talking about this from the context of parenting. How does the idea of generational cycles impact our role as a spouse?
Yeah. So I think a lot of times we see the way that spouses express their love to one another is often similar to what they saw growing up. Or again, we can see the opposite. Like, I saw my parents, disagreeing with each other. And so I'm going to make sure that I agree with everything. And of course, neither one makes for a healthy relationship, right? But a lot of times we see almost like the secret of the generational cycle appearing in the love languages that are expressed between spouses. And the love language is expressed towards children as well. So if someone grew up in a household where the love language was constantly one of service, where, mom would cook and clean, maybe for dad, the love language was gifting, they keep the roof over the head and provide the food and the meals. In the marital relationship, you may find that being the same type of response where the spouse, the husband, exhibits, the love language of gifting. He spends money, and he feels like that's his role. The wife exhibits service, making the meals, maybe dropping things off, taking care of household items. And it creates a bit of a divide because it could be that the wife actually wants and needs affirmation in terms of love, but she's not receiving that because the husband is just repeating what he learned, or the husband may actually need touch or time and he's not receiving that. And so that will often trickle down into the children as well, because you'll see the relationship between husband and wife becoming very functional. They coexist, they function, they work together, maybe. Sometimes they don't, sometimes it can be dysfunctional, but it will impact the children, the way they raise the children, the way they exhibit love to the children. And if their love needs are not being met, it can be really, really difficult to meet the love needs of their children.
It's very fascinating. And the idea that I heard you say was that these generational cycles often impact the way that we love one another. And I can certainly see that. I also imagine, my hypothesis is, it likely also impacts maybe our roles. Like, what does it mean to actually be a husband, or what does it mean to be a wife? And like, what are the roles that I play in the house? And what are the roles that my wife plays in the house? Because as I am trying to do a little bit of introspection right now, I think, as I think about, how we delegate work in the home, a lot of that is kind of impacted, in some ways, by what I observed my own parents doing. And that also gets a little bit tricky because my parents are kind of different than my wife's parents. And
Mhm.
so, there is a need to almost calibrate our own expectations and make sure that like we kind of create our own set of roles in our family. I wonder, is that an area where you've seen conflict or problems arise?
Yeah, so absolutely, roles and expectations, and what couples kind of enter into a marriage thinking that they will see. Many times they come from our own households, and something as simple as I don't know, like a division of labor, like you said. A household in which maybe the wife grew up in a household in which her father was always helping. He was always engaged, always hands on with the children, with the kitchen and whatnot, and maybe the husband grew up in a household in which everything in the household was delegated to the mother. The father was only meant to leave the house, go to work, and come back. And so the wife may enter into the marriage expecting, like the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was described by Aisha radiallahu anha, that when he was not in worship, he was in service to his family. She may be coming in with that expectation. That's what she saw in her home. And yet the husband may be coming in with the expectation of, الرجال قوامون على النساء. My only job is to be the provider and the protector, and I'm doing that by working. And so you see this clash that comes in that area. So absolutely, we tend to learn these roles from what we see at home, but we don't have to live them. We can navigate through them. And this is why I'll give a little bit of a plug. We're so passionate about premarital education and premarital programs and pre-parenting programs at Cornerstone, because really education and the tools to have the knowledge to be able to learn how to undo, how to unsee almost what you saw growing up, positive or negative. In those two scenarios, both households may have been very functional and had positive atmospheres, but they may not fit for this marriage. They may not fit for raising these children. So learning how to kind of steer a fresh course, I think it does require preparation and education, and really seeking out avenues in how to become that best version of yourself, whether spouse or parent.
I'm curious, Dr. Susie. There's no doubt in my mind about the role that my parents have played in shaping my own life. I also recognize, though, that it's kind of interesting, and I don't know if this is true or not, but there've been other influences too that I've seen that I've kind of, those role models have played an interesting role too. So, for example, when I would watch TV and I would see a husband and a wife couple, and I'm like, oh man, I want to be just like them. Or like if I watched it as a child, or if, for example, there were a uncle or an aunt, or someone at my masjid whose family I idolized, and I'd say, man, I want to be just like them. Um, are those also like real influences on us, or are those kind of really superficial?
So I think, we can't help but, look around our environment and see how it impacts us. There's a reason why Islamically the Ummah plays such a large role in terms of our deen and how we function. Those that we surround ourselves with and our community definitely plays a role in influencing and shaping us. So role models, yes, sometimes we may look to others and we may learn from them, but also kind of keeping in mind that nobody really knows what goes on behind closed doors. And
Mm,
sometimes, how we carry ourselves externally may be very different than how we are, within our homes. And we pray that Allah Azza wa Jal, protects us from ever being hypocritical in
I mean,
how we interact. But I think it's, yes, we can be influenced by those around us, but we don't ever want to fall into the pitfall of comparing, of saying, oh, look at that husband, he's so nice to his wife, or look at her as a mother, or look at how the kids are with this family, because that can be really dangerous territory. We see it a lot of times with social media, and seeing the image of a happy family and thinking like they're so perfect and the grass is so much greener on the other side. So we want to be really careful with that.
And I think, the impetus behind my question is two reasons. One is out of a little bit of anxiety, okay, because here's what I realize. What I realize is, in the same way that I've been influenced by my parents, I know that my kids are also going to be influenced by me.
Mhm.
And so there's actually a lot of pressure in that too, right?
Mhm.
And this idea of, wow, I really do have to be my best self. And certainly I think that is the case. And we actually have a responsibility, a religious responsibility, if we, value the legacy that we leave through our children. The other thing I think about is, well, if I and I'm thoughtful about creating a community of practice for my child, right? And helping my child um, build relationships with other adults, whether that be, teachers, whether that be aunts and uncles, whether that be, really cultivating the environment that he and she grow up in. In some ways, I wonder if I'm able to take a little bit of the anxiety off to say, alhamdulillah, like I'm playing my role of trying to be a good role model, but I'm also trying to introduce positive role models in my child's life. And then the second reason why I asked the question is like kind of just for fun. I remember when I was a kid, there was a show called The Cosby Show. And okay, Bill Cosby, we're not going to go into like him and like, his history and all that. But from what I understood, um, the Cosby Show played a really important role in the Black community because of the role that Bill Cosby played in showcasing a role model of a family. And I wonder if there's opportunities to do that for our own kids as well, to expose them to positive, role models in this way.
Yeah, yeah. So I do think, it takes a village, and if we think that as parents, we are going to be the only influencers on our children, we are definitely incorrect in that thought process. And I think, when we look at the rise of YouTube personalities and, TikTok stars and what's happening on Snapchat and, Instagram, and, we see just how influential outside, characters essentially can be on our children. And when we look at the stages of tarbiyah, we know in that first stage from age 0 to 7, we are their core role models, and there's no getting away from that. That is the stage where our children will look to us for a sense of safety and security and to guide them in terms of how they should be, right? But then from age 8 to 14, that is the stage in which they look externally. They will look to friends. They will look to, pop stars. They will look to YouTubers. They will look to classmates and peers. So cultivating an environment in which, those who surround our children are, hopefully influential in a positive way is important, but also cultivating an environment in a safe space in which our children can talk to us about those influencers, those characters on television, who may not influence them in a positive way, and talk to us about what they feel and how they respond to them. That's super important as well.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Susie, what I am leaving this conversation with is a number of pieces, but at the top of it is this idea of awareness. Like you mentioned, I think being aware of the role that our influences, namely our parents, have made in our own behavior, that's really the first step towards making sure that we're able to break any of the kind of toxic behavior that comes through these generational cycles. And I think through this conversation and literally, trying to listen to everything that you shared, I think I've also become a little bit more aware of some of the behaviors I have with my children as well as my spouse. I also learned, I think, about how there are oftentimes two ways to respond to these generational cycles. One is to emulate the behavior, another way is to overcompensate, which is kind of fascinating. I also learned about the importance of actually trying to heal, and that healing is actually a pretty critical part in order for us to actually change our behavior. And we know we've healed when we're actually able to change our behavior. Dr. Susie, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I want our listeners to know Dr. Susie is the founding director of Cornerstone. Now, Cornerstone is an organization that does provide counseling internationally. And a lot of that counseling doesn't actually have to happen in person. It can actually happen online. Their website is cornercounseling.com. And that's where you'll be able to learn a little bit more about Dr. Susie and the wonderful work that they do. Dr. Susie, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. It was an honor to be on the show.
The pleasure was all mine.